nobody
Okay,
will
I
I don't think we need it, right? This
No,
panel is in English.
Water?
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for this important panel on the security framework in the Middle East. Let me start by introducing our guests today. There's Tariq Masood, Ford Foundation Professor of Democracy and Governance of Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. We have Ebtissam Al-Ketbi, President of the Emirates Policy Center and Professor of Political Science at the UAE University. We have Ali Vaez, who's joining us on Iran expert, and he's the Iran Project Director at Crisis Group. And we have Ms. Cinzia Bianco, who is Research Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you very much for joining us today. We will be looking at security in the Gulf, but also more broadly in the Middle East. Before we start, just a few brief remarks on some of the trends that we've seen over the past few years. I think one of the most important trends has been a kind of withdrawal of the US and the West. So we've seen America and its Western allies taking a step back. At the same time, we have seen Middle Eastern countries, regional powers, stepping up. So becoming much more assertive, embracing foreign policies that are much more independent and then don't always align with that of their Western allies. We've seen, for example, the war in Yemen and the blockade against Qatar. And this speaks of the new leadership, for example, in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has played a particularly active role in the region under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. But we've also seen other dynamics, also local, regional players playing a bigger role internationally. For example, Qatar has played a crucial role in facilitating the withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan and in helping with evacuations there. And more recently, when it comes to Ukraine, we have seen some of the Gulf countries trying to play the role of mediators while conspicuously maintaining a neutral policy posture, which again speaks of the probably growing differences between the West and some of its kind of long-time allies in the Gulf. Why don't we start with Ms. Ebtissam Al-Ketbi? Could you talk a little bit about what is the UAE perspective on security?
Well, I prefer to speak about my perspective rather than UAE perspective. I don't wear an official hat. That's why it will make me feel more comfortable in talking about that. Although I don't think this is different from GCC perspective. You know, the problem also regarding when we're talking about the security in the Gulf, that the imbalance of power in the region, this is the main problem. You have militarized power on the other shore with all of nuclear power, missiles, drones, and on the other side you have less armed, without a defense umbrella from the West, and any tension between the Iranian with the Israeli or the Iranian with the American, the retaliate comes to the Gulf. We saw this after death of Soleimani, or Soleimani killing an Abqaiq on the tanks of UAE. So I would say the region requires demilitarization, which enable political settlements and de-escalation the tension. So if always we have this imbalance of power, and you will always have the problem of the security, and one only approach for the security, which is all Iranian explained it in the Hormuz, which it means Iran will still the sole power and hegemonic power in the region. More cooperative approach, this will be for one part of de-escalation. And here I can talk about what UAE perspective, okay? Which is a rapprochement with Iran, okay? And that came from that. Fighting with Iran will not be in the benefit of anybody, even of the Iranians themselves. So rapprochement with Iran, if there is basis, can be. Of course, it doesn't mean Iran is not representing a threat, it is a threat. But how can you live with that threat? How can you cooperate with that threat? Through the business interest, which is the elite in Iran, and they have also business interest. Okay, so also there are environment, if we can cooperate, because we are always, all of us, facing the scarcity of water, the climate change. There are many things. So build on what we can agree, and the issues we don't agree, we leave it aside. We can solve that through negotiation or dialogue or whatever, but we don't put it as to preclude any kind of cooperation.
Thank you. Ali, Ebtissam mentioned rapprochement with Iran. Can you talk a little bit about Iran's perspective on security in the region, in this changing geopolitical landscape?
Sure. First of all, it's great to be here. And let me start, as Ebtissam said, with a caveat that I'm not Rob Malley. He was supposed to be on this panel, and I represent neither the US view or the Iranian official view. But you know, what's stunning is if you compare where we are at the end of 2022 to where we were at the beginning of 2021 when the Biden administration came to office. I would say at that point, the US wanted to step away from maximum pressure, wanted to restore the nuclear deal, and was very supportive of an inclusive regional dialogue in the Gulf. From the Gulf perspective, also, I think, having experienced the side effects of maximum pressure, the fact that the Gulf countries were collateral damage in the confrontation between Iran and the US, I think there was realization that a deal, even if imperfect, is still better than no deal, that there needs to be channels of communication and de-escalation with Iran. And so, you know, at the end of 2021, there was a joint communique by the US and the GCC supporting both restoration of the nuclear deal and also further inclusive dialogue. Iranians too, I think, were on board with this agenda. They wanted economic reprieve, of course, and they already had started de-escalation with the Gulf countries. As you know, there were 5 rounds of negotiations between Iran and Saudi Arabia facilitated by the Iraqis. There were extensive talks with the Emiratis. The relationship with Qatar was going very well as, of course, with Kuwait and Oman. So things look much more promising then. Now we're in a completely different world in the sense that the US seems to now slowly entering maximum pressure 2.0. It's very unlikely that the nuclear deal will be restored. I think the Gulf countries are still hesitant to move in the direction that they were moving under the Trump administration. But you already see the side effects of blockage in the nuclear diplomacy and relations with the Gulf. And also, more importantly, because Iran is now engulfed in domestic turmoil, and it sees at least the hand of some Gulf countries, whether it's true or paranoia, I'm not getting into that. I'm just saying, it's quite something when the head of the Revolutionary Guards, senior Iranian officials come out and publicly threaten Saudi Arabia. And of course, the Saudis had intelligence last month that there was an attack by the Iranians in the making as a way to deter the Saudis from continuing to support some of these satellite channels that are beaming into Iran and supporting the protesters. So, you know, and I really feel the escalation between Iran and Saudi Arabia, it's very unlikely to happen. This, of course, have implications elsewhere in the region, like in Yemen. Obviously, Iranians always have a preference to push back against their adversaries indirectly. And of course, pushing to Houthis to escalate, to renew attacks on Saudi soil is one way of doing that. And you know, the more the regime is embattled, the more it would have an interest in becoming more aggressive, because there is this view that an embattled regime will be forced to be focused internally. But you know, there's 4-decade behavioral pattern of the Islamic Republic, and again, it usually becomes more aggressive in the region when it's more repressive at home. We saw a small episode of that in 2019. Remember, in 2019, there were also protests in Iran, and in a matter of 3 days, the regime killed 300 people. Now we're entering the 3rd month of protests, and more than 400 people have been killed, but there is the possibility of an incursion or an escalation in Iraqi Kurdistan. So the protests could have the kind of side effects that I think we're not paying enough attention to right now.
And Tarek, from the US perspective, we have obviously a very shifting geopolitical picture in the Middle East. You have on one side, dialogue with Iran is much harder than it was before. So even with a hostile country, things are getting more complicated. And on the other hand, you have, you know, long-standing allies with whom the relationship is also becoming a little bit more complicated. How would you define the US role in the region today? And how do you see Middle Eastern countries responding to this new posture?
Great. So probably I should utter the same disclaimer that Ibtisam did with respect to the US. You know, Margarita, I've always found this refrain that you hear in the Gulf about the United States withdrawing from the region to be somewhat puzzling. And, you know, I think some of it comes from the way that President Obama used to talk about the pivot to Asia, which never made sense to me, because how do you pivot to a place that you're already in? I think some of it has been a function of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which people in the region think portends a bigger withdrawal. But as one former US official recently told me, look, in Asia, in East Asia, after the US withdrawal from Vietnam, there were the same kind of fears. And look, almost 50 years later, we're still there. But I think a lot of this concern about US withdrawal is a function of strategic immaturity on the part of many of the countries in the region. It's almost as if the United States is not bombing Iran or standing shoulder to shoulder with Saudi and Emirati forces in Yemen, that it's somehow dismantling its empire in the Middle East. And that seems to me profoundly wrong misreading of the US. I think if you look at the US's presence in the region, we've got dozens of military facilities that aren't going anywhere. The US has a clear track record of defending the territorial integrity of its allies in the region. It's not going to help its allies crack down on domestic dissent, and it's not going to shore up a regime, but it absolutely has a rock solid record when it comes to preventing foreign incursions. But, you know, if you think about this strategic immaturity, so I think, in other words, I think a lot of it is that I actually don't see a US withdrawal from the region. And as what Ali pointed out, though, and Dr. Ibtisam pointed out, some of this rapprochement or attempts to engage with Iran, this is what President Obama was calling for. You know, remember in that interview he did with Jeffrey Goldberg, and he said, look, you should figure out a way to share the region and come to some kind of cold peace. And of course, there was a big hue and cry about that. And what ended up happening? That's what they ended up trying to do. And as Ali points out, the dynamics in Iran now are a little bit, are causing, putting that on hold. But I think what the current moment reveals is that there's been some strategic immaturity on the part of our allies, and the US position in the Gulf hasn't really changed.
Mm-hmm.
May I add just something?
Yeah.
Because I want to react towards that. Well, Dr. Tarek, why the Gulfists try to diversify their partnership, mainly when US pivot to Asia, also they pivot to Asia, because 2015, they looked to the GCPOA, it wasn't for their interest, and it did not stop Iran from attacking them. And in fact, the credibility of US for them when Abqaiq has been attacked by the Iranian and our tanks, and UAE did not do anything regarding that. The second example, when we have been attacked with the Houthis missiles, and from Iraq and from Yemen, and US did not do anything. Now, since that, the Gulfists thought that they should also to look to their interest. And if US is not going to protect them from Iran, let them approach Iran through cooperation, through regional dialogue, through so and so. And this is the dilemma. Now, I've been in Manama, and many of US officials, their missions is to assure the Gulfists that we are here, not leaving. But the Gulfists knows that they are here not because of protecting us, because they don't want China to be, or they want to counter China's presence in the region. This is the reality. Thank you.
I saw Tinsa nodding. Is there something you want to add on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think, given that I do work at the European Council on Foreign Relations and we are in Italy, Europe, I want to sort of bring it back to a European perspective. I think, and this is after 12 years of interacting with counterparts in the GCC, I think I've sort of seen a shift over the past few years that really has been surprising me. And I can say with some degree of confidence that in my analytical opinion, the US is at its weakest point, geopolitically speaking, in the Gulf region since I started this job 12 years ago. So I do understand the point that Dr. Tarek was making, because I've been hearing these points, as Dr. Ebtissam was saying, from several parts of US officials, especially leaning close to the Democratic Party and the progressives, and US academics as well, and analysts, that the US is not withdrawing, that they are right-sizing. And honestly, I don't want to get into a conversation about how many thousand troops there are on the ground in Saudi Arabia right now. I don't want to get into how many patriots were withdrawn at the beginning of the Biden administration. And Dr. Ebtissam already mentioned that there was complete lack of reaction to major attacks happening on GCC soil. The point I want to make is that the GCC countries are sovereign states, and they have absolutely no doubt that in their perception, there is a withdrawal of the US. And there is a lack of vision and interest from the US part on the role of the Gulf, geopolitically speaking. In other words, their opinion and their perception is that in the US, the Gulf no longer plays a central role into the future geopolitical asset of the world, not really the region, the world, because the US is a global actor and thinks globally. And they compare and contrast this all the time when we speak about that with the Chinese approach, which again, might be true, might be not true, but in at least the perceptions and the way that the Chinese themselves are presenting it, they have a vision for the wider Middle East and North Africa, in which the Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula plays an absolutely central role into the dossier that is the most important dossier for Beijing, which is connectivity. The Chinese go to the Gulf and say, we look at your area as playing a central role in connecting Asia to Europe and to Africa, because of your central location, because of investments into infrastructures. And we're talking traditional infrastructures, so ports, railroads, and so on, airports, but also new infrastructures, the digital one. And we are going to see next week, I think, all of these coming to life in a very, very momentous summit taking place in Riyadh with China GCC summit, a China-Saudi summit, and a China-Arab summit that will also be extended to other Arab leaders. And I think our American friends will be quite surprised by the outcome of that summit. And again, then, as I promised, bringing it back to a European and Italian perspective. It is really, I mean, for Europe is finding a new relevance of the Gulf as well. This is because of, seeing the Gulf as potential important partner on energy security, but also on aid and development in the wider region, the green agenda, climate, water security, a lot of interest in Europe working with the UAE towards COP28, especially on water and climate issues. However, we have been working with the assumption for decades that the Gulf was an American lake and that the US was the sole and unchallenged hegemon of that region, and that we could sit back and relax and not really take care of the really problematic dossiers and files and challenges of the Gulf. I think this time is over, and I think if, as Europeans, we do decide that the Gulf is important strategically for our energy security and our geopolitical priorities in the wider region, including North Africa and Africa, and I mention these because these are obviously the Italian priorities, then it's time that we also start taking on more responsibility to the extent that is possible and is also important for our own interests, onto the more problematic aspect of the region.
Absolutely. And so, yeah, as you mentioned, it's not just about the United States maybe being less focused on the Middle East as it used to be, but also that priorities don't always align. So Gulf states have realized, often our interests are not the same as American interests. And you see that a lot in terms of the relations with China and Russia. And Tarek, I wanted to ask you, how do you see this kind of great power rivalry, this kind of global instability kind of playing out in the region?
So, I mean, this is a great question. I mean, I think, to respond to this point about China, I mean, you can't on the one hand say that the concern with the United States, as Dr. Ibtissam mentioned, is that the US didn't defend the Saudis or the Emiratis when the Houthis lobbed missiles at them, and then say, and consequently the answer for us is to deepen our relationship with China or to deepen our relationship with Russia. They're not going to solve that problem for you. And so I think, again, this goes back to this point about the strategic immaturity. So I don't know about this summit that's going to happen with the Chinese, but I'm sorry, it's evident to anybody with two eyes that the Chinese model's failed, or it's in the process of failing. If you want to, and so we often see, as Dr. Ibtissam says, the Americans said they are going to do a pivot to Asia. Well, we can do a pivot to Asia as well. Okay, let me know how that works out for you. The Saudis talked about wanting to sell their oil in yuan. Okay, presumably this is going to hurt the US dollar. You know what else it's going to hurt? The Saudi riyal, which has been pegged to the US dollar forever. The Emiratis make a deal with the Chinese to build a naval base until the Americans find out and force them to stop it. And you think, of course, the Emiratis knew that the Americans would find out. So what were they doing? Is this a kind of schoolyard sending of a message? I mean, I think it again speaks to this strategic immaturity. Russia, Russia is such a basket case that they are now having to get military assistance from Iran. That's the country that you want to have a deepened alliance with in order to rectify whatever or cover for whatever shortcomings you think are in the US commitment to the Gulf. So I think, again, there is this real, I can't describe it other than strategic immaturity. The fact is the future of this region, to the extent that there are good things happening in this region, I would say Mohammed bin Salman was exactly right when he said, without you Americans, we would have been North Korea. And if you look at all of the positive changes that are happening in Saudi Arabia or the positive changes that are happening in the United Arab Emirates, in large part, these come as a result of American influence. And so the future for that region, in my view, is to deepen its connection with the US. And if you think the US is letting the rope go slack, you should pull on it instead of trying to find these other patrons that do not have what you need and represent, this kind of, the irony is, the non-aligned movement, we laugh about Gamal Abdel Nasser's policy of non-alignment from, 60 years ago, and now our allies in the Gulf seem to want to be picking it up. That seems a step in the wrong direction.
One area in which there is cooperation is the kind of rapprochement between the Gulf states and Israel. Abdeslam, can you talk a little bit about the Abraham Accords and how and the ripple effects of that in kind of regional politics?
Well, if you allow me, just I have a comment on
Yes,
what
please.
Dr. I cannot, because, well, with all respect to the military umbrella is U.S. providing the region, it's not for free. We are paying for that, okay? Al-Udeid base has been done by the Qataris. Only the American put their troops there, and they are enjoying the free, okay? Still, this does not mean that our relation with the United States indispensable, and it is important, and they will still our ally. But the bitterness we felt when this, what I mentioned, example happened, and Dr. Tara, the China's presence in the region did not happen in one day. Belt and Road has been taken how many years under the American? They were not seeing what's happening in the region. They are, and they were happy with that. Well, let the Chinese put their money, let they build the infrastructure, we will join the free rider in that. Okay, but the Chinese, I know, they are not going to bring the protection for the Gulf in terms of militarily, but it's not either or, okay? Either us, we don't look to China as a threat. The Americans look to them, but we don't. They are strategic, economic, strategic partner. But we know our strategic partner, in terms of strategic partner militarily, it is with U.S. How to balance that? You mentioned Russia. Well, why do we have to look to things what is good for United States? It's good for us. We have our national interests as well. And US has to respect, Europe has to respect that. Why we should side by your interests and forget about our interest? You didn't side with our interest when it happened with Iran, and you look only for the nuclear program. I didn't look what we are facing, the arsenal of missiles, the arsenal of drones. And now I look at it as double standard. I'm a hypocrite now. When Europe mentioning now, what von der Leyen said in Manama Dialogue, that now Europe considering Iran is a threat for regional security. Come on, we were trying to convince you that this missiles is threatening us. And you were not listening. Only when these missiles reach your homeland, now you figure that this is threatening the regional security. Come on, this hypocrite. What if next year you are going back to JCPOA? You will stick to what you said, or things will change. This is how we feel in the region. Now, coming back to, sorry, because I couldn't pass it without saying what I have.
Well, there's a clear sense of betrayal, right? And trust will take some time to be.
No, there is misunderstanding and there mistrust between us and the American, and some of European, and how European, they look to us through their framework, through their parameters, and we have to be European like them. We don't want to be. We have our own model, okay? And you have to respect it as we respect yours. But this is how the misunderstanding between the two regions. Now,
On one area where you do get along, it seems to be.
okay, you can go and we come back to Abraham Accord if you want.
No, go for it.
No, for me, in the beginning, I look at it as a game changer, and now any regional security framework should consider the strategic shift and the Abraham Accords created and their potential prospect. The Abraham Accords brought a new strategic environment, I would say, to expand the regional cooperation frameworks through health, through artificial intelligence, through economy. The Abrahamic funds which has been created, it gives some hope for the new generation in both sides, those whom the signatories of the Abraham Accord and the Palestinian. The only problem now we are facing that the new government, which is it shows that two-state solution is not on the table now, and how because marketing the Abraham Accord based on that, will bring solution also to the Palestinian. Now, how to deal with this government? This is the main obstacle we are facing.
And Ali, from the Iranian perspective, when as we see this kind of closer ties between Israel, the UAE, and other Gulf countries, how is that perceived? How it's factoring in kind of broader security picture for Iran?
Sure. Let me just add a few points on some of the issues that came up, especially on China. I want to remind everyone that China has excellent relations with Iran. It has tried to hedge its bets. It's true that it also has good relations with the Gulf countries, and in fact, it imports more oil from the Gulf countries than it does from Iran. But there's one difference between Iran and the Gulf countries that I think geostrategically the Chinese can't overlook. And unlike we in the West, the Chinese don't plan for the next 2 years or the next 4 years, electoral terms. It's much longer term planning. And the one place in this part of the world which will remain energy rich for the foreseeable future, in which the United States does not have a foothold, is Iran. And that is a fact that the Chinese are not going to overlook. And I think that is something that the Gulf countries should take into consideration regardless. Second, I don't want to relitigate the past, but because this comes up repeatedly, I think it's worth saying it, that I remember during the nuclear negotiations, the Gulf countries themselves did not want the West to bring up regional issues behind their back because they were not at the table. The P5+1 was a structure that was mandated by the United Nations Security Council and had one task, which was the nuclear issue. The nuclear deal was a nuclear deal, not a nuclear regional missile deal. It is true, however, that in the aftermath of the conclusion of the deal, there was an opportunity for building on it, building other agreements on it, regional, missile, addressing other issues. But I think the mindset at the time wasn't where it is today. As Tarek said, when Obama said, you have to have a modus vivendi, it was as if he had said, he had uttered blasphemy. I think the Europeans and the Americans, they always were concerned about Iran's missile program. But there's also this vicious cycle here that we have to take into account, which is the fact that Iran's support for partners and proxies, at the end of the day, stems from the fact that it feels in a region that is basically surrounded by the United States, from a conventional military capability is inferior to a lot of other countries in the region. you know, the UAE Air Force compared to the Iranian Air Force is night and day. I mean, the Iranian Air Force dates back from the time of the Shah. It's a flying museum. It's not an Air Force. And so the forward defense policy of supporting partners and proxies and the ballistic missile program all stem from the Iranian perspective, from their threat perception. Now, of course, what is seen by them as offensive is perceived by the Gulf countries as, as defensive by the Iranians, is perceived by the Gulf countries as offensive. And there's a very nebulous border between those two perceptions. And so the Gulf countries rely more on the US, which I think at the end of the day, because of the kind of military equipment they have, they really don't have a lot of options for diversifying. But that point, I think, has been hammered already. And they drag the US further into the region. Now they have better relations with Israel, which deepens Iran's threat perception, which then pushes Iran to double down on its missiles and on its forward defense policy. And so at some point, this cycle has to be broken if we want to have a more stable region. Now, the Iranians have been living with Israel, having good relations with their neighbors for many years, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Iraqi Kurdistan. So they're used to Israel being next door. And they have communicated to the Gulf countries that if the relationship is cultural, economic, social, that's fine. But if your territories are going to be used as a launching pad for intelligence and military operations against Iran, and that's an entirely different game, and then your territories will become fair game. And I think the Gulf countries understand that. That's why every time you see Israelis talking about an Arab NATO that will be in full coordination with them, the Emiratis, the other countries in the region say, no, this is not an alliance against Iran. And I just don't see Israel and the Gulf countries being able to really move in that direction of creating an anti-Iran official coalition, because it has significant costs that, although Israel might not really care about, the Gulf countries are fully cognizant of.
Cinzia, I wanted to ask you, to what extent do you think we talk about the Gulf, but to what extent can we really talk about a common Gulf security position? Do you think greater integration, greater cooperation is possible or not?
So I agree completely with the reading that Dr. Ali had of the question of, and Dr. Ibtisam, which is interesting because they were not exactly the same, that they had about the escalation in the Gulf, in the sense that I think there is a slight difference of views in Saudi than there is in other countries in the GCC on this question. So as Dr. Ali was saying, obviously Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, have been for a while already pursuing the escalation and the re-engagement. And as Dr. Ibtisam said, the UAE has also become quite active later, but arguably even more active than the others. Saudi Arabia is in a slightly different position also because it is more threatened by Iran. If it wasn't for the US intercepting shipments that were already almost in Yemen and full of missiles and drones, we would be talking about a completely different situation right now. And this happened only 2-3 weeks ago. So there are slightly different positions, but I think overall, if we can sort of describe a GCC outlook on Iran, is a combination of trying to rebuild the deterrence formula, which in their views was overly based on the US and is no longer reliable, and to rebuild that deterrence formula with a diversification of partnerships where you don't have only the United States, you also have a number of other NATO countries, because of what Dr. Ali was saying. They have interoperability of systems, but also in some more niche cases, Chinese cooperation with China. And already, there has been rumors for a while of deals there's a very old, dating to the 1980s, cooperation on ballistic missiles with Saudi Arabia. Then there have been in the past, and now again, talks about acquiring drones from China, which are items that the US is not willingly selling to the GCC partners. But long story short, rebuild this deterrence formula with a combination of their own independent capabilities and a diversification of partnerships, while at the same time also doing engagement to lower the level of tensions and the level of perceived threat. So that is where I think the Europeans can be useful, because as we all know, the Europeans have always been, you know, they have many flaws, but they're very consistent. And they have been extremely consistent in saying what we want to see is a region of players that get along with one another and that explore cooperation. France, one of the largest EU member states, has been active into having a first conference on partnership and cooperation in Baghdad. They're trying to figure out a way to have a second round quite soon. In another regional capital, again, talking about potential cooperation and engagement between the different Gulf countries and other countries in the region. I think there's going to be a lot of focus on environmental security, in particular water scarcity, but also economic diplomacy, something that the UAE is quite strong on. Saudi Arabia has the Saudi Middle East Green Initiative. So they have obviously have an interest and have resources and projects at the regional level on that. And the European Union has the know-how and the political will to play a much more active role in that sense. It's okay? It's fine. So yeah, long story short, I think if there is still, which it seems that there still is, the idea that you will need to lower the tensions with re-engagement, I think the Europeans can be useful partners in that. And on the several fronts, working towards COP28 in the UAE, working with the Saudi on the Middle East Green Initiative, there are a lot of opportunities that can be exploited to try and make this re-engagement and de-escalation a bit more sustainable and durable and resilient to shocks.
Thank you, and sorry for my coughing fit. Tarek, I wanted to ask you, there's this clear sense of betrayal. I mean, we're talking about how the US remains very engaged, but there is, especially among Gulf countries, this sense of betrayal. And I think the withdrawal from Afghanistan was a reminder of that. After 20 years, the United States turned its back, and Afghanistan is now back under Taliban control. What can be done to rebuild that trust, do you think?
Yeah. That's a great question. I want to take advantage of this just to also respond to something that Dr. Ibtisam said. When she pointed to the US and its unwillingness to defend its allies in the region against attacks by Iranian proxies. And you said, the US was only interested in the Iran insofar as it has its nuclear program. And I think, it's very important that we do recognize that, Iran, through its proxies, has been one of the most avid persecutors and killers of Arabs. This is not questionable. But in Iran, with a nuclear weapon, is going to be much less restrained. Its proxies are going to be much less restrained. So the American attention on the Iranian nuclear program was not misplaced. It's part of a much broader picture. In terms of, rebuilding the trust, again, as a political scientist, we never want to attribute behavior to stupidity or to personal foibles. We always want to think that the ways that states behave are a function of a kind of rational reading of their interests, their capabilities, et cetera. But, it's hard to sustain that kind of analysis in this case. And so I guess what I would say is that the onus for this really does lie more on the part of America's Gulf allies. And let me just give you an example. So, this point about strategic immaturity. So, the Americans think that they had, over the summer that they had a deal with the Saudis to, at least not cut production. Then, of course, that didn't come to pass. And, it's hard not to read that as the Saudis saying, this will teach the Democrats, okay? First of all, that's quite a stupid thing to do, given that the last thing you want is for the American relationship with Saudi Arabia or for any country in the region to become a purely partisan issue. And so that was a very poor move. Now, how did the Americans respond? Did the Democrats respond by saying, okay, now we're going to get even? Because remember, the move utterly failed. Okay, President Biden's party had the best showing in the midterms that a president's party has ever had, or not ever had, but has had for quite a while. And so it didn't even work. And then, but how have the Americans responded? The last piece of news that we heard is, in fact, they have now followed through with granting Mohammed bin Salman immunity from prosecution for the assassination of Gamal Khashoggi. So the Americans, in my view, are displaying a great deal of maturity. And I think our Gulf allies, which really, I cannot exaggerate enough, this should be a Catholic marriage between the United States and our Gulf allies. They need to be wary of making this American they're making their repeated complaints about an American abandonment of the Gulf into a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Abdeslam, do you want to respond?
Yeah,
to that?
sure, I want to react to that. Well, Dr. Tariq, label hypocrisy. Okay. Now, both European and American, they were emphasizing on the incidents of Jamal Khashoggi. With all respect, hundreds of people were killed in Iran every day. Nobody mentioned that. Nobody sanctioned them at that time, okay? Because they are running for JCPOA. They want only to sign the deal, regardless the violation of human rights from the Iranian regime. Okay, only one incident happened in the Gulf, okay? Because the guy happened to be American. If it's happened to Saudi, they don't care, okay? Now, the issue that all the American, the European, raising the issue of human rights in Iran. I was with one European envoy 2 weeks ago, and he was asking me about the deal, the Iran, the situation in the region. And he was telling me now regarding the violation of human rights in Iran, we are going to change our position. And I get, well, come on. This is a real hypocrisy. These people has been killed every day since this regime came. Now, just you realize that the human rights violation, because Iranian now, they are sending their missiles and drone to Russia. Now you realize. So, Dr. Tariq, this is, I don't buy it, and I don't think people in my region, they buy it anymore from the West. The hypocrisy is the label. Now, regarding the issue of US and its commitment in the region and what happened in Afghanistan. What happened in Afghanistan gave a bad image for US that it is not credible in the region. And it can pull itself, and it happened. They pulled the troop from Iraq, and they left Iraq. Okay, you remember under Obama's. Okay, of course, Trump did worse, and Biden is not doing better than the previous ones. Okay, now, when it comes to the oil issue, the West only looking to the things from their own interest. Well, come on. Also, we have people to feed in the region. This government also responsible and its people to feed them. The high prices oil benefit us also, but you want only, I'm not saying that the Saudi, they did it deliberate because of this is how the American, they read it. But they didn't do it deliberate just because of the election. It happened that it came before the election. Relating this issue with the other issue, I think this came just in the mind of the Democrat. Well, when you are also want to cooperate with us, European and American, regarding the energy, you only look at it from your interest angle. Before you are asking us, stop bombing, you are cause the climate change problem. You are the cause of climate change problem. So you have to stop bombing more oil. And we were in negotiation, and we felt we are under pressure, and we are accused. Now, you are also putting pressure now on us that you have to pump more because you are causing energy problem in Europe, and you are the cause of that, and you are raising the oil. Come on, what should we do? Tell us. You don't sit and negotiate with us, and there is dialogue between us and you, how to come in the middle, which serves your interest and our interest. Stop sending us order. Stop dictating us. In fact, the EU strategy, I was talking to Shinzia before, this new strategy is dictating the Gulf what should they do. Okay? It's only they look to the European interests. What about our interests? Okay, why you don't consult with us? It doesn't mean what's good for you, good for us. Let us reach in the middle so we can cooperate with you. Stop dictating us, please.
Chinsa, do you think that there's more common ground that can be found with Europe to bridge some of these disagreements?
I think, a couple of points. The first one is, again, another reason why, and here I'm going to really come across as a Macronista, but one other reason why we really need to develop sovereign autonomy and strategic autonomy everywhere in the world, including the Gulf, is because otherwise, it's normal that Dr. Ibtisam, as many others, lump us together with the United States, when in many, many cases, we have had a different approach to issues vis-a-vis the United States. I mean, I don't want to go back too much in history, but even if we look at the oil issue and the latest oil conflict and differences between the US and Saudi Arabia, actually the Europeans have not reacted anywhere like the United States. The United States reacted with a lot of anger and frustration and a lot of emotions, at least rhetorically, and threatening consequences and so on. We didn't. No European official, publicly or privately, had this reaction. There was a much more cold-blooded acknowledgement that Saudi Arabia had the right to decide on its own oil policy. I will say, in the interest of transparency and honesty, that was also because the Europeans were, in this case, having their own conversation with Saudi Arabia about buying much more oil from Saudi Arabia, and also launching energy partnerships, especially with the UAE and Qatar, that are much longer term and starting with oil and gas, then also look significantly into investing into renewables. And already we have, I mean, this is already a reality. The UAE has already been shipping renewable hydrogen to the port of Hamburg in Germany, which is then used for industrial processes. So it's already reality. So in this case, I think there is, it's very important to make that distinction clear, that, also because we are allies, that doesn't mean we are exactly in the same page in every situation. And we also have our own problem of attitude, because, as Dr. Ibtisam was saying, the new EU Gulf strategy has come across as an imposition. And I think this was because it was not properly explained about what it is. It is only and exclusively from the European perspective, because it is a European exercise to define among ourselves what are our interests and our priorities and the potential policies that we can pursue in the Gulf. So it is only European because it is only addressed at Europeans. The second step, which I hope, and I think should happen soon, is there will be an official response from the GCC countries to that strategy, and then the two documents will be basically taken together into official consultations to get a synthesis of both sides' interests.
And Ali, one last question for you. How has the war in Ukraine complicated the relationship between Europe and Iran?
Well, it's a major rupture. Although I would say the perspectives are very different if you talk to the Europeans and you talk to the Iranians. The Iranians say, you know, this visceral reaction from the Europeans is hard for them to understand, because they are maybe as much of a belligerent because of provision of arms to Russia that is being used in the Ukraine conflict as the UK or France are because of provision of arms to the UAE and Saudi Arabia that were deployed in the Yemen conflict. But I think the Iranians miscalculated how close this issue is to European hearts, how it affects their threat perceptions from Iran. I mean, what Dr. Ebtisam was talking about was really hard to imagine that a few years ago the Europeans would come out this strongly against Iran, but now they see Iran in the same camp as Russia undermining their security. And this has really, in addition, of course, to human rights violations, which has tainted Iran's image even further in the West, and especially in Europe that is so concerned about human rights, has really deteriorated the situation. But I think at the same time, you know, it's unfortunately coming at the worst time possible, because with the further bifurcation of geopolitics, this is basically reaffirming that view in Iran that the West is unreliable. The US has already proven, given what happened to the JCPOA, that it's completely unreliable. The Europeans, despite their political support for the deal that helped it survive Trump administration years, but they couldn't deliver on the economic front. So from their perspective, the Europeans don't have strategic autonomy and therefore are irrelevant. In a situation like this, I think further pushing Iran into the arms of Russia and China is a geopolitical mistake, but the Europeans are unfortunately moving in that direction at a very high speed. Now, I think there is potentially space because, you know, there is deep-rooted popular mistrust towards Russia in the Iranian psyche and within the society. And so there is possibility of trying to dissuade Iran from further moving down that road. But this is not where I see the European mindset being at this moment.
Okay, I think we are out of time. Luckily, because I'm about to have a second coughing fit. But thank you so much, our panelists, for the discussion.